so Darwin's epic journey here. This is the beginning of chapter 16. We talked about the map just to refresh your memory. Then I flipped through the pages too fast. So Darwin, his journey, the Galapagos turtles. This was something I wanted to point out, that these, come on now, you can do it. These turtles here, let's see, let me go view, page display, page view.
Oh, what's your turtle?
What's that? Can you guys see that turtle all right?
Turtle?
Nope, it disappeared.
No, we see the map, or I see the map at least.
The map? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, turtle.
I can't see the top turtle for some reason right now.
No. The second one looks weird.
Yeah,
It just
so
looks really funny.
that's what I wanted to show you. Let me see if I can drag it. There we go. So what do you
It's
notice?
like long neck and like,
Yeah.
it almost looks like it has a hood.
Mm-hmm. It's
Yeah.
shell.
Any idea why that would be?
Yes, I do.
I mean, it
Because it
says
needs to
it.
reach higher branches.
More like, I guess, different locations. They have different.
Yeah. So this one that why can't I reach it? Stupid computer. Sorry. Display, enable scrolling. How about that?
No, sometimes I call my computer stupid too, so it's not a problem.
So this is
I call my phone stupid too.
this is from one of the Galapagos Islands, Isabella here, this great big one. And this turtle eats things that are on the ground, right? Grasses that it finds, this tortoise. And this one is the Hood Island tortoise. And Darwin saw these things. I think actually the crew rode them around the island on their backs sometimes because they were so big, and played games and had races.
Let's play music.
Wait,
So,
why?
so
That
this one has a long neck, and the hood is all the way up here so that it can reach up. So this is showing an adaptation. This was part of what inspired Darwin with the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, that this tortoise and this tortoise were probably related. It's unlikely that a lot of them spontaneously arose. They ended up on these islands though, and they developed differently based on what was there. Right? In the competition for survival of the fittest on this island, Hood Island, if you didn't have a long neck, you didn't live, you didn't survive to reproductive age. So that was something I wanted to show you there. Question on that? Armadillo. This was the work you did for me on Friday. Hutton and Lyle. So Darwin was born in 1809. He left for college in 1825. So he'd have been, how many years is that? 25 minus 9, would have been quite young, right? 16. And he lived until 1882. So he got out of college in 6 years, and he went to sail on the Beagle in 1831. He got back to England in 1835. And 3 years later, he finally read Lamarck's work on populations, even though that had been written 40 or 50 years earlier. But he read that in 1838. And in 1838, right after he read that, he came up with the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And he wrote it all down. And then you forward 21 years to 1859 is when he publishes the book. And the reason is because in 1858, Russell Wallace was a friend of his, sent him a letter, and he said, here's an essay that I've written about the same topic, right? How things evolve over time and descend with modification. And Darwin realized that he was in danger of being scooped, that Wallace was going to get credit for the theory of evolution by natural selection. So he published his already written book within 6 months in 1859. So he sat on it. Why did he sit on it for so long? Why did he not want to send this thing around? Let's see, who's unmuted and awake? Grace Tay, what you got?
What was the question?
Why did Darwin wait 21 years after he had written his book to publish it? Why wouldn't he publish it straight away? What was he worried about?
Um,
You need to phone a friend?
Wasn't it?
We talked about it. I touched on it briefly the last time we talked.
Was it because it was like a controversial topic?
Yeah, it's because he knew he would be accused of trying to replace God as creator and as the supreme being who's involved in life on earth and in human life. And he knew this would be a big social crisis that was created. He knew he'd be ridiculed and people would make fun of him and say, you're being an idiot. That's not how it could possibly work. God's in charge. So, and last time we talked, I tried to explain how this is still a fight, right? Darwin was right. This is still a problem. There's still lawsuits about this. There are museums dedicated to proving the opposite or proving the biblical interpretation of creation. So that was the reason for the long delay, even though he had written it. Here in chapter 16:2, right? Things that shaped Darwin's thinking, ideas that shaped Darwin's thinking. Hutton and Lyell came up with this idea that the Earth is really old and that things have changed it over time. Darwin extrapolated that out to the idea that maybe if the Earth can change, living things can change too over time. And he also saw a very fast change where an earthquake happened and geologic change happened in front of his eyes. The land shifted and he thought mountains could be made that way. And then he worked that into the theory that animals could change, life could change quickly or slowly. Sorry, Allison, question?
I just have like a quick question. Do you think that like we evolved from apes?
So that's the predominant theory, and I don't see a reason not to think that.
Wait,
So it's actually not the apes per se, but the chimpanzees.
yeah, 95%.
Yeah. So the apes were like a separate branch off of the family tree that led to us, is what the theory is. So I think from a scientific perspective, it doesn't make sense to assume that we showed up on Earth fully formed. And the Catholic Church has a position on this, that evolutionary theory is the best explanation for how we got to be here and how the world is the way it is. And but that at some point after essentially monkeys or orangutans became human beings, God infused an immortal soul, is how that's answered.
Okay.
Right?
Mr. Holden,
Darwin read, so Lyell's, yes,
did you know that chimpanzees eat monkeys?
yeah, I think I've heard that.
Yeah,
Oh my god.
that surprised me too.
Poor monkeys.
Been doing some outside reading, huh?
Yeah.
It's just poor monkeys. I don't feel bad for chimpanzees. I feel bad for chimpanzees.
So Darwin, Lyell wrote his book, Principles of Geology, 1 year before Darwin left on his boat trip. So we actually know that he read it on the boat trip on the Beagle. He had it with him for the 5 years, and that influenced his thinking. He talked about that in his diaries and journals. Then Lamarck he read right after he got, Lamarck he was aware of ahead of time, right? No, he read Lamarck right after he got back. And Lamarck, he was so close, right? He realized things evolved. He realized that the environment had something to do with it. right? And his only mistake was he thought that he didn't understand how genetics work and that acquired characteristics can't be passed on to your offspring. So if I lose my hand in an accident, there's no reason my children would be born without hands, right? But according to Lamarck's idea, because he's ignoring how genetics and heredity work, that is possible. So he was so close to being right, and almost had it long before Darwin came up with his idea. Thomas Malthus here, right, who also predates Darwin, is this economist, and he was also an Anglican priest. And he came up with the idea of competition, right? Many of you got this right in the homework that was due Friday. And Darwin took this idea immediately, and he said, yes, this is part of the theory also, right? That things compete and within an environment, and they have differences among them, which allow for evolution to happen. So I'm going to skip over artificial selection now, right? I showed some of the girls my 2 dogs inside, right? Those are recent creations of artificial selection, right? Somebody decided poodles were kind of neat because they don't shed and they're pretty smart and they're really healthy. But they decided also that Labradoodles and Golden Doodles would be even better because they're really friendly, sweet family dogs who are kind of lazy. So bam, artificial selection, right? Happening in your lifetime. This is the timeline of when all these things happened. You know, when Darwin went on his trip. This is what I want to look at now. What is evolution, right? So evolution is this idea that life changes over time, right? And we now call it, Darwin called it descent, meaning life has changed. Lyell gave him the idea that things can change slowly, and Darwin saw that they could change quickly, but the fact that they might be really old and do change, right? Survival of the fittest right here is a common phrase to describe Darwin's theory of evolution, right? So the fittest isn't necessarily the one who can lift the most weights or run the fastest, right? If you are slow but can climb a tree, that could make you the fittest, right? Thus the sloth, right? Sloths, we think, crawled up into trees a very long time ago and have not changed, right? Some other animals that haven't changed in millions of years are cockroaches, right? Super fit for their environment. They can't really get better at surviving in it than they are.
They're disgusting.
Sharks, right? Sharks have not evolved very much at all, we believe. They're very ancient. They're like swimming dinosaurs. So there's a lot of things that don't change much, but then there are a lot of things that go out of existence also, right? Right? They become extinct. This page here gives us a summary of Darwin's ideas, right? 1, the struggle for existence, right? This is Malthus. Life is hard for some organisms, right? 2, variation, meaning that there are differences. So in this case, grasshoppers, right, can, due to natural variation in genetics, some of them end up brown and some of them end up green. Adaptation is the idea of who's best fitted for the environment, right? Who's got the best adaptation? Is it brown or green in this case, right? Survival of the fittest here would be a bird has an easy time seeing brown grasshoppers and eats them. And then natural selection leads to more green grasshoppers. So this is just a little portrait of how it works. There was a really bad experiment done in England in the late 1800s around London that gets a lot of criticism. So England went through the Industrial Revolution. Lots of factories were built. Factories make smoke. Smoke makes soot everywhere, covered trees and buildings and things like that. Air quality wasn't very good. I'm sure you've seen pictures from India recently where people can now see for miles, right? Because the smog is gone. Mexico City, Santiago, Chile. So anyway, back to England, late 1800s, there's soot everywhere. And somebody did, and so the theory was that the moths all became black because the white moths got eaten, and which made sense. And then somebody did an experiment in the early 1900s where they glued white moths to dark trees, and they noticed that birds came and ate them a lot. But that was a bad scientific design because you got multiple variables there, right? You're not one variable at a time. Right? You're testing if a moth glued to a tree gets eaten and if a white moth on a dark background gets eaten more often. So that experiment was discredited later on. So natural selection is Darwin's idea, right? Not evolution. That was other people's ideas, but he embraced it early on. But evolution wasn't an important concept unless you could explain how you thought it happened, which is where the idea of natural selection, the theory of natural selection comes from, right? So it's a situation in which more individuals are born than can survive, the struggle for existence. There's natural variation, and there's different levels of fitness among the individuals, and so some get to survive, some don't. Right? Nowadays, at this point in history, this gets a little fuzzier, right? People have made a difference to this equation. Like my dogs might not survive in the wild, right? Artificial selection has made it such that human beings breed them, sell them, take care of them, feed them, right? I have no idea how they would do if they were left to their own. I think they would eat grass all the time and throw up though, because they're not very bright that way. So, and people don't really compete these ways on most of the planet anymore, right? So, and to some degree now, there's a theory that the way we compete, people do for natural selection, is through getting an education and learning and being able to support ourselves. But then if you remember back when we studied populations, there's the problem that the more education people get, the fewer children they have. So that theory doesn't really work either. So the theories of evolution, I don't think they really stick with the way people live now. It's easier to see with animals, right? Squirrels. So in my neighborhood, the squirrel population is through the roof right now. We have very few foxes around, right? But and there aren't very many bunny rabbits because there were a lot of foxes here a year or two ago. There are plenty of acorns, so the squirrel population is really high. People aren't driving very much, so they're not running the squirrels over. So there's all kinds of factors one can identify on what organisms get to survive and which ones don't. I was reading, let me get to that in a few minutes. So we got Wallace, we've got variation, right? Genetics. Darwin's travels in the Galapagos really showed him that turtles vary, finches vary, right? There's differences among these species that should be the same. When I was there, we got to see tiny penguins. Right? There's a special penguin in the Galapagos, which is near the equator, right? Nowhere near the South Pole where these things originate. And it's a little penguin without a lot of fur, so that it can survive in the heat. They're only about full grown. I think they're 10 or 12 inches tall. Super cute. We got to ride on a boat and go poking around behind some rocks in the water, and we saw 2 of them. And the theory is that they've been there on the Galapagos Islands for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And some of them had some variation, adapted, and survived. So that adaptation is that trait that lets you survive and live to reproduce. Now, the problem is, from a religious perspective, is what chooses the level of fitness? It's the environment. So if your environment is hot, right, and you can survive heat better than the person next to you, then you win. If your environment is cold, if your environment changes, right, if it's variable, so it's hot in the summer and cold in the winter, right, the organisms that can handle both are the ones that get to survive. The ones who can find food, even when there's snow, get to survive, or that can hibernate, right? So hibernation among lots of mammals is an adaptation that made them more fit for their environment when their food sources aren't available. Punctuated equilibrium. Let's see. Jafia, what's punctuation?
Like in the normal vocabulary.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, like being on time.
To be punctual, good. And
Yeah.
in writing, it's the things that go at the ends of sentences, right? They finish them.
Yes.
The
Yes.
punctuation or the commas that
Mhm.
break them up as they go along. So we have this
Mhm.
word, an equilibrium. Allison, do you remember what equilibrium means? Sorry, you just popped food in your mouth. That was rude.
Sure. Equilibrium is like making sure that everything is equal.
Yeah, it's in balance.
The same.
Yeah. So punctuated equilibrium is a theory. There was a guy, Stephen Jay Gould, who's one of the most famous evolutionary biologists. And he came up with the theory of punctuated equilibrium. And what it says is that for long periods of time, there's very little change in a species. And then punctuation happens. It happens really quickly. There's a lot of dramatic change in a species where there's some genetic changes. Now, the problem with this theory, we now know that most genetic mutations are bad. Like 99.999% of genetic mutations are bad for the organism that gets them. But evolutionary theory requires that there be good mutations every once in a while that lead to a dramatic change. But then it's hard to tell, it's hard to tell how this could happen. So the eyeball, right? Your eyeball is made up of a lot of different tissues and parts. And having an eyeball before your brain knows how to use it and to process the images is not helpful or useful. So then how, if punctuated equilibrium is how things evolve, then how did the eyeball come into being? Did it happen all at once, right? These cells that can sense light and the chemicals needed to do that, and the tissues and the lens that can focus the light, and the part of the brain that can read those impulses and make sense of them, right? Did that happen all at once, or was that designed by God, right? So that's the argument from design, right? Works better sometimes than some of the evolutionary ideas about natural selection and how complex organs come into being. So this is one of the reasons why we still argue about this in our culture. So one of the best examples of punctuated equilibrium was in Samoa. There are these butterflies, and a few years ago, a bacterial infections, which probably means there was a sex-linked chromosome problem, that bacteria could hurt. Uh-oh, my internet connection says it's unstable. Never said that before. So these butterflies, the number of males went down to 1% of the population. And so the butterflies weren't able to mate and the numbers were plummeting. But then within about a year, there was one butterfly, they assume, or maybe a couple, had a mutation that allowed them to resist the bacteria, like we see with antibiotics in bacteria, that the bacteria become resistant. In this case, the butterfly became resistant to the bacteria. And in 1 year, the percentages of male butterflies went from 1% to 40%, right? So that's clearly punctuated equilibrium, right? But that was a single gene change, right, in the immune system of those things. So here, common descent on this page to jump topics. Darwin drew this. This was the first evolutionary tree. I have here, I think I can show it to you. Oh, no, it's on my web page. There it is. The human family tree. Let's see if it comes up. There it is. So this is from the Smithsonian Institute. And this is trying to show us, you guys can't see it yet. Not coming through. All right, I'm going to stop the share. And then I'm going to start the share here. There it is. Two computer thing is working much better. Thanks for your patience. So this is from the Smithsonian. Here's us up here. Homo sapiens is our genus and species name. And you can see some of these other things that are like us. So these are organisms that we find fossil evidence for. We find evidence that they were drawing things in caves, right? The Neanderthals from the Neander valleys did a lot of the cave art going back hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus was upright walking man, right? He's erect. And we see DNA
Yes,
from
we
Homo
have you.
erectus in Homo sapiens. Homo habilis here, that was handyman, right? We found lots of tools. And genetically, these groups are all slightly different from each other, but our DNA has evidence of inbreeding, right, between them. Heidelberg is a region in Germany, and Rudolfensis, I think, is named after the scientist who found it. But then if you come down here, there's this other branch of the tree, the Australopithecus group. So this is Lucy over here, Australopithecus afarensis. This was a larger version, Australopithecine africanus, right? So this branch of the tree died out. So Lucy was originally called the missing link, but actually now we think that if you look at the main branch of the tree leading to us, Lucy was an offshoot of the branch, right? And that our branch came later. So if you go down here in the tree, we're related to Lucy, right? The further down you go in time. So, and if you can see over here, it's 5 million years ago, essentially, was when we were related to Lucy, right? Versus up here, right? 3 million years ago or so, we were related to these guys over here, right? Large teeth, powerful jaws. And really our branches of the tree seem, also about 3 million years ago. And these are the earliest humans and the closest link to the primates, right? The orangutans and things like that. Right? So these are the ones that we think started walking upright early on. So descent with modification, I gotta stop this, and then I gotta go back. This one over here. Descent with modification from Darwin here. He tried to sketch one of these out first, how these things are related. And notice up here he wrote, I think, and then laid out on paper. I don't know which organism he's talking about here and how they're related. But these sorts of trees are still very commonly used as a way to show how organisms are related to one another. Now that we have genetics work in DNA, these trees get redrawn all the time. Every time we look at the genome of an organism, we find it is or is not related to what we guessed it was when we were just going based on how they look and how they live. And I'm getting towards the end here. Where's my, stop that share. I wanted to show one more thing, this fellow. So this is the of classification. There was invented Linnaeus. Let's see, do you have this yet?
Is this where we come from?
Yeah, that there's. Oh, did it just go away? Let me see. Come on back. All right, I'm gonna try going downstairs. Sorry if this makes you dizzy. See if the internet is better down here at this table. So this system of classification was invented, and it's where you have a kingdom. So this is kind of a tree, and every organism fits inside the tree. So this is Homo sapiens, us. So when I was in college, we came up with domains. So we're in domain Eukarya. That means we're eukaryotes. We're in kingdom Animalia. That means we're related to every animal. So this is bugs, worms, people, fish, birds, everything. We then have a phylum, and that's Chordata, right? So that means that you have a spinal cord, a nerve that runs from your brain to control the rest of your body. So a lot of animals don't end up having that, although worms do, and insects have a simple one. But then our subphylum is Vertebrata. That means that our spinal cord is wrapped up inside of a vertebrae, bones that help protect it. Our class is Mammalia, right? This is warm-blooded, mostly placental mammals, right? There's a few exceptions. Our order is primates. So this is where we diverge. This is our last meeting with the monkeys in our taxonomy. And then we have a family, the Hominidae. Those are those old creatures, right? Or human-likes or hominoids that we were looking at just a minute ago, like Australopithecus afarensis. Our genus is Homo, and then our species is Homo sapiens. So I think this is Latin for man, not the Greek for like, Homo. And then sapiens is thinking. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.